Hello and welcome to episode 534 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Ad Levitan. One of America's great gambling events is upon us. It is, of course, March Madness season, aka bracket season. And although we don't cover college basketball here at ETR, we are unhealthily obsessed with peer-to-peer gambling games and the micro/macro strategy around those games. So here we are to discuss March Madness. I am joined by two sharps in the college basketball space, Jason Lisk of teamrankings.com, of Pool Genius, and our own Jack Miller, a closet college basketball freak. Jason, how's it going? Welcome back to the show.
It's going great. Thanks for having me on. It's always good to be back with you.
Jack, how's it going today?
Going well. This is probably my favorite week of the year, so pumped to be on talking with you guys again.
Before we get into it here, want to let everyone know you can get a March Madness package on Pool Genius by going to poolgenius.com/ETR. Head there if you want more sophisticated help with your bracket. That's poolgenius.com/ETR. That's Jason's content, and they will go ahead and give you some pretty big discounts, anywhere from 10 to 55% off by using that code because they love us here at ETR. That's poolgenius.com/ETR. All right. Let's start here, Jason. Just brackets 101. What is the simplest strategy? If you could just tell someone as quick as you can, the simplest strategy, the overarching strategy for what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to do when we fill out our bracket in a sophisticated way. What is brackets 101?
101, don't be as risky as most people think you should be. Just identify those top 5 to 8 teams, isolate some. You're going to get enough variation in how people pick the final 8, final 4, just from among the favorites, that you don't have to take big swings in most pools. Unless you're in like a huge contest, massive contest, 10,000 entries, 5,000 entries, whatever. In most small pools that people play, be a little more conservative, look for small value edges, identify teams that are reasonable risks.
I think a huge mistake that people make is, March Madness has a lot of upsets. I'm going to pick all upsets. And yes, March Madness will have a ton of upsets. Identifying which upsets there will be is something that people are way overconfident in their skills at. I know we talked about this last year, but I used to do a thing in certain pools where I would just find the betting favorite for every single game, or projected betting favorite for every single game, and just take the favorite there, and had a ton of success that way. It won't be every year, of course, but yeah, I mean, people are just being way too contrarian and out of control. I think one thing that we're trying to do at a high level is identify which teams have the best win probability and compare that to public pick data. And I know that sounds crazy and overly complicated. It's really relatively simple. Jack, what do you think about the whole conversation around contrarian and figuring out win probability for these teams?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the name of the game. And these days, there's a bunch of sources you can use to estimate win probability. Maybe the best ones are on the sports books because they have the biggest liability against them. So you can compare the money lines, find which team's the favorite. But there's also public models like KenPom, Team Rankings, 538. All these sites have estimated win probabilities for teams. And then I play most of my brackets on ESPN. They make it super easy. They have a screen that shows the exact percentage of public brackets that are picking each team to go to each round. So what you can really do is just compare each team's win probability, or in this case, maybe odds to win the championship, and compare that to the percentage of teams or the percentage of brackets that are picking them on ESPN. And then you can find teams that maybe are going under owned. It's similar to DFS in that concept, and that we're looking for leverage and finding teams that are going to go under owned by the public.
Yeah, I'm curious, Jason, where you think win probabilities are the best and where they come from, because I'm not a college basketball dude. I can't sit here and say, Duke's going to win 60% of the time or 61% of the time. I can look at round 1 and figure out win probability there based on the line. I can look at odds to win their region. I can look at odds to win the national championship, but I feel like there's a more sophisticated way somewhere along the line of figuring out win probability. How do you think about figuring out win probability or advanced probability, I guess, for each team?
I mean, we of course we're going to look at market data for the betting markets for sure. because sometimes the pools don't match up with that. Pools tend to be a little not as sharp. You get a lot of public people. You get people that just play pools, but they don't pay attention to betting lines. So you'll see some massive edge differences in some teams where you're like the public doesn't like that team, but the market's telling you that they're really good. We adjust our own. I mean, we'll look at KenPom. KenPom is going to be near the betting number, by the way. I mean, I think the betting markets take something like that into account. What KenPom doesn't do is his is just like and our raw ratings don't look at injuries, don't look at recent form. They're just like if there's a lineup change and injury, you're probably going to see that more in markets on like the bigger popular teams because people are aware UCLA is missing a starter now, except for example, and so that's going to impact their market down a little bit from what you see on KenPom. So we take that and we look at lineup info. We have our own ratings that we do too internally where we adjust things on lineups. How some of these mid-majors do, sometimes the markets aren't as sharp because they don't know those players as well. People don't have the news. So sometimes you get some mid-majors that have been on runs because they changed lineups, had injuries, and you can get an edge where you're like, that team's actually better than their raw numbers because they have a different lineup now.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, and so I think step one for me when I'm making my bracket is get win probability I'm comfortable with, whether that's on Pool Genius or Team Rankings or figuring out my own market data based on betting lines or advanced rates, which we'll talk about here in a little bit when we get to the micro portion of this program. But yeah, figuring out win probability, I think an advanced probability for each round is step number one. Step number two is comparing that to public pick.
Yeah.
Now, I know ESPN releases this. I think Yahoo releases this also. Jason, how accurate do you think those are, and how would you go about projecting what our opponents are going to do? Say I'm in a pool with 100 of my buddies. It might not line up exactly with what's on ESPN. How do you think about figuring out what our opponents are going to do?
Yeah, I mean it's both art and science, right? In your specific pool, if you know actionable intel on how your pool will pick, you should incorporate that. ESPN, I mean, they showed the ticker. They've got 4 million something entries already in as of this morning. But the thing about ESPN is they preload with favorites. And so some people may sign up and start filling a bracket, but they don't finish it. And so you're going to get too much skew towards some favorites early with ESPN data. You just got to keep that in mind if you're looking on Sunday night, Monday morning. It'll start moving toward where it'll end up, by Wednesday. Run Your Pool, which I know you guys partner with and which we have a relationship with, has lots of good data. A lot of sharper players play at Run Your Pool. So we incorporate some of that. We take from lots of sites because we want to get kind of the masses and the sites like Run Your Pool and see where the data is going.
Yeah, I like that for sure. Jack, from a process perspective, once you have win probability and once you have market data, it's easy to identify leverage in like really big spots. Like let's say only 10% of pools are picking X team to advance, but we have them advancing 50% of the time. That's really simple. Other times it's going to be close, like 15 versus 10 or 13 versus 10 or 20 versus 10. How do you think about trying to leverage off in these spots in a pool?
Yeah, so it kind of comes down to pool size. Because if you're in like a 5-person pool, you can probably just pick Alabama or Houston, especially Houston right now. I mean, as Jason said, it's going to change, but right now Houston looks pretty underowned and Bama overowned. But if you're in a bigger pool, then maybe you have to dig deeper and look for a team that, according to the numbers, has like a 3 or 4% chance of winning it all, or even lower, but they're only being picked in 1% of brackets. So how much you really need to push those contrarian plays and the leverage points kind of depends on pool size, and that's basically the name of the game.
Yeah, I was thinking pool size and also payout structure, right? Jason, like, pool size is clearly very important. The bigger the pool is, the more contrarian you need to be. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit. What are your cutoffs for how contrarian you need to be in terms of pool size? But then also, some of these pools pay like every cent to first, which is like for DFS
Right.
people are well aware of. I obviously prefer the pools where I think second or third or fourth or whatever gets some more money. But there's a lot of pools out there where every cent goes to first. How would you adjust your strategy for that, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, with our customized picks, you can sign up for multiple brackets, input multiple brackets under the same subscription. We would give you different advice if you were in, say, a 350 person pool, 350 entry pool, where it all went to first versus there were 20 payout spots. We would give you different risk advice. So we are structured that way. I'll give you some examples of why that matters. At a 1 in 350 chance, right? You may just want to roll like basically what's the equivalent of a better futures play than you can get in the betting market on somebody like an 8 seed that's got a 2% chance or 1.5% chance when nobody else may pick them, right? That may be worth it. You're just like, I'm going to take that team. It's my futures ticket in this pool. But if you're getting 20 payout spots, that's probably too risky, right? You want to be like, if you got a realistic 1%, 2% chance of getting in the money, you don't want to be quite that risky. And so there are differences. I mean, if you get to the extreme numbers, just identifying that one value play that's really a long shot, but has better pot odds than your chances of winning it going in are the way to go.
Okay. I want to get to some micro stuff here. People, enough. They want actual teams. They want actual picks. Now we're recording this Monday midday. Obviously, brackets came out a little bit less than 24 hours ago. So some of this data is still kind of taking shape. I want to start with odds to win it all. Last I checked, Houston was plus 550. So that implies they win around 15% of the time. Alabama plus 800. So is Kansas around 11% of the time. UCLA 9% of the time. Jason, how would you think about odds to win it all, or should we be looking more at the region stats for the advanced numbers? And then generally, what do you think about these teams at their current odds and at their win probability versus public pick percentage on some of these favorites like Houston, Alabama, Kansas, UCLA, et cetera?
I'm going to talk micro on these teams overall. The 1 seeds this year are not as dominant as 1 seeds in the recent past. The relative difference between them and everybody else is a little lower. And that means, I mean, if you look like Alabama's the second and they're like plus 900, I believe, in some of the books I looked at, which puts them at what? Just over 10% if you once you take the juice out. And so it's a lot tighter. And so you don't have like this, 30% to win the title this year. You just don't. Because Houston at 550. Now it's also a one-way market, right? A lot of these you can't bet not Houston. So there is some downside risk to Houston because Marcus Sasser was hurt in the semifinal. And I think he'll play. He's their point guard. He missed the final. They lost to Memphis. But we don't know that 100%. It's like a muscle injury. So there is some downside risk that probably those books don't have to change that number. They can leave it at 550 because, if he plays, they want that number there. They don't have to. So I think there is some downside risk to Houston. I think there's risk with a lot of these teams, and I think it's a lot more narrow this year, which means you want to look at more value than you would in, say, in a year where there's, this team is 40% to make the Final Four. And so I think there is a lot of those questions. The 1 seeds just aren't as separated from everybody else in our numbers.
Yeah, that's interesting. It feels more wide open to me as someone who's just kind of perusing from a really high bird's eye view. Jack, what do you think about the 1 seeds this year, and what do you think the right play is with them in pools?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I still think, I mean, it kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier. If we're talking about bracket pools, I still think it kind of makes sense to still pick the 1 seeds to go pretty far because, like we talked about, people tend to get overly contrarian. But I think it's pretty indisputable that, especially compared to the last 2 years where it's kind of just been Gonzaga in the field or Gonzaga and Baylor in the field a couple years ago, it definitely feels like everyone is a whole lot closer this year. And teams like Bama and Houston aren't nearly as good as those Gonzaga teams have been the past couple of years.
What do you think the public is doing, or what do you think our opponents are doing, Jason? I know we have some initial pick data already. Is the public not on the 1 seeds this year, do you think?
The public, so far in early data, Houston is somewhat of a value play at market odds. I think that's because of recency, right? They just lost on Sunday right before the selection show. Alabama looked good. They are the favorite. So those two are more similar in their market odds, but Alabama is the more popular. Now, At small pool sizes, you may want to go Alabama over Houston, stay with the public on one, and because Houston's a value to the Final Four, not just the final. And so you're getting value with Houston kind of all along the way. People are kind of hesitant on Houston, it seems like. They don't play in a power conference, and they had the injury, and I think there's some hesitation there. So that's one to watch. Most of the ones and twos they always come at slightly negative value, which makes sense. You've got to play just kind of like DFS. You got to play some of the good plays, right? You can't just play a bunch of contrarian plays. You've got to take some of those top seeds. I do think teams like Duke, Connecticut, that have good market odds aren't as popular as you would think in the betting in the pools versus how the betting market's treating those teams.
You mentioned Duke. I saw some controversy about Duke's seed. I didn't follow it at all. I feel like Duke is always overseeded, and this year people were like, "Oh my God, why is Duke a 5 seed?" I feel like Duke is always a really public team, and people always pick them to go far. Any feel on that, Jason?
So, are they overseeded relative to how the committee's done it in the past? No, I don't think so. Based on how they kind of assess teams and view these quad wins and all that. Are they better than their raw numbers? Yes. And I think the market's moving there because they have talented freshmen, several of whom were hurt in November, several lineup shifts midseason, and now those young players are healthy and coming together. And so they've looked dominant. They've looked like a top 10, 15 team in the last month and a half. Kind of like how North Carolina looked down the stretch last year compared to what they looked like in December, November last year. So I understand why the market's moving on Duke. I think they got seeded based on their full body of work correctly. 4 or 5 was probably about where they should be. But power rating, they could be a top 10 team right now on talent.
Got it. Yeah, that's super interesting for sure. I want to go region by region here to end it and see what you guys think about some of this more micro stuff in the region. Let's start with the West, where it seems like it's really wide open. Kansas, UCLA, Gonzaga, UConn. Advanced probability in the Final Four is not all that different there. Jack, any thoughts on the West here?
Yeah, I think this is pretty clearly the toughest region. I mean, you've got Kansas as the 1 seed. UCLA rates really well in a lot of the metrics, but they lost arguably the best defender in the country in Jalen Clark, and then their center, Adem missed the Pac-12 championship game with an injury, but I think he's expected back. And then Gonzaga has been just on a tear lately, and according to the advanced metrics, UConn and St. Mary's are also underseeded. So this is kind of the region of death. I think Gonzaga could be pretty dangerous based on the recent form and the fact that UCLA is a bit dinged up at the moment. But really, I think any of those top 3, 4, even 5 teams, if you want to throw St. Mary's in there, could make a run to the Final Four, and it'll kind of just come down to ownership and pool size in terms of whether it's viable just to take Kansas all the way through, or if you're going to want to take someone else. But this region is really just pretty stacked, in my opinion.
Jason, any feel for what our opponents are doing in the West?
I think they are. Well, first of all, this is definitely the toughest, as Jack said. This is the toughest. I would even throw TCU in there as a 6. They had some injuries, but at full strength, they've looked dominant too at times. They killed Kansas on the road when they had everybody. So that top 6 is loaded. I think what you're seeing is, of course, the Kansas is going to be popular. They were the national champ last year. So this is probably a region where if you play a portfolio or you play multiple brackets, you're going to have different combos coming out of this, depending on your rules and where you think the value is. But it could be on Gonzaga. It could be on, Connecticut probably are the 2 value plays, but Kansas and UCLA are the 1 and 2. So they don't have the tougher matchups right away. So, I mean, it's a balance. Do you play those 1 and 2s or you take the value? I think you're going to see a combo, and it depends on your pool size. I think a lot of these make sense in different types of pools and rules.
Yeah, seems really wide open, and pool would not have to be that big for me to get contrarian in the West because I think it's really wide open, big time. Let's go to the South. I'll start with you here, Jason. Alabama is a big favorite in the South. I'm seeing something around plus 190 to make it to the Final Four. Arizona is also here. Baylor is also here.
Yep.
In the South. Any thoughts on this region, Jason, and what do you think our opponents are doing?
So I think Alabama got a good draw because of these matchups. I think that Baylor is a vulnerable 3. They're just not good defensively. They're very guard oriented. Those kind of teams have sometimes burned people right away in the past. We've seen like teams like Iowa that were offensively skewed, Ohio State a couple years ago, teams like that. So Baylor's a concern. But that said, Alabama, because of that, is super popular. I mean, they're the most popular team to get to the Final Four. And so it depends again on pool size. You might want to be conservative with Alabama at smaller pool sizes, and you might want to be more contrarian because none of these others really stand out. Arizona could make a run, have turnover issues at times. All these teams are vulnerable. This is probably, to me, the weakest region, top to bottom. But I think it depends. Alabama is going to be so popular because of this draw, and it balances out.
Right. Yeah. And betting markets are going to lead people to Arizona also in a big way. Jack, any thoughts on riding here? I'm sorry, on Alabama, riding here with Alabama or going more contrarian in this region? I think you're on mute, Jack.
Sorry. Yeah, I think Alabama's a good call here. I don't think really Arizona or Baylor are just in the same neighborhood as them. I do think if you're in like a huge pool, I don't think you need to do this in 99.9% of pools. But I think Creighton is going to show as a really good value based on where a lot of sites have them power rated. The thing is, the reason why you don't want to go with them that far unless you're in a huge pool is because they're only 5-point favorites in round 1. So they could easily lose to North Carolina State in round 1, but they do show as a top 15-ish team around the country. And as Jason said, Baylor's pretty vulnerable on defense, and relative to their seed line, Creighton is way underseeded based on power rating.
Okay. Let's go to the Midwest, where Houston is a massive favorite, even bigger than Alabama. Jason, you talked about how Houston is the most popular team. Again, they're the most popular team to win it all. I'm seeing around plus 120 to make it to the Final Four. I believe Texas is also in this region, but not a lot of other resistance on paper, at least. Strikes me as an interesting spot to go for a fade here, considering how often I expect them to be picked, but that could be crazy. Jason, what do you think about the Midwest?
Houston's actually coming at a little bit of value in this not in the early rounds, but by the Final Four, they're not actually being overpicked right now. We'll see where that ends up. Texas has played well lately. I don't think it's a great draw for Texas. A&M is a tough 7. And so all those things kind of add up, all those risk factors. Like if you play a tougher 7, your chances of getting all the way through 6 games are just minimized a little more. And if you're playing a bracket and you're trying to reduce risk, that's the risk with Texas is they start getting tough draws right away. This one has, I think to me, it's probably Houston in most brackets. But if you play alternates, you might mix something else in.
Buddy, I'm not sure if you're aware when you mentioned Texas A&M, but they have a very, 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 very difficult round 1 matchup against shout out Penn State.
Yeah, well,
go ahead.
Let me. So A&M tough matchup and a tough stylistic matchup for Texas, I think. But Penn State's actually a good matchup for Texas A&M and a tough one for them. Penn State makes shots. Penn State is great at defensive rebounding. A&M needs to get on the boards. They're like an athletic team, not super high efficient outside shooters, but athletic, get on the boards, play with energy. If Penn State, who is a really good defensive rebounding team, can keep A&M off the boards, that's a good matchup for Penn State. So I worry Penn State is a negative matchup for A&M, but then if A&M advances, they're a negative matchup for Texas. So it's kind of it depends on how this bracket breaks.
I've watched this Penn State team a few times just because I'm not really that into Penn State football. It's mostly a joke, but I actually really do like Penn State basketball. I was there when the Crispin brothers were there and Giassi Kleinherd, and they went to the Elite 8 where they lost to Temple, actually beat North Carolina on their way to the Elite 8. One of the great moments in my Penn State career, if you can call it that. And yeah, I hope they make a run this year because they have an awesome,
this is a
awesome
fun
front
Penn
team.
State team. I mean, whether the way they play, they're fun to watch, which you can't say about a lot of Big Ten teams. So that's you know, they're on the Big Ten scale. They're definitely at the fun end of it.
Love it. Jack, any thoughts on this region here in the Midwest, which features the favorite Houston?
Yeah, as an Illinois fan, I just want to say I know all about Penn State this year. We're 0-3 against Penn State. Jalen Pickett just went crazy in one of those games. But yeah, I'm with Jason here on Houston right now, appearing underowned. I do think maybe we see them increase throughout the week. I was kind of surprised when I checked ESPN ownership this morning and saw how low they were. So I think that could come up a little bit. But at the current numbers, I think it's pretty much a no-brainer. And by pretty much all the advanced numbers, they're pretty undervalued and pretty clearly the best team in that region. So as of now, I think Houston is who I'm going to be backing there.
I
Jason,
also this is a region where some of those mid seeds, if you're in an upset bonus pool, become in play. There's a lot of these teams like Drake, and if Mississippi State advances to face Iowa State, teams like that, if you're in an upset bonus pool, some of those can make sense, especially if you have Houston coming out to take your chances in the early rounds in those kind of pools.
yeah, upset bonus pool is interesting. I know a lot of people play that format. I don't really play in too many of those formats, but I think it's pretty popular. Any like overarching strategy for people who are in those kind of bonus for upset style pools, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, we customize advice based on the scoring structure. So like some of them are pretty wild. Seed pools are the wildest. I love playing those. Like you literally get their seed number for if they win. Like a 10 seed, you get like Penn State, you get 10 points. Well, in that kind of pool, man, you might want that team in the Final Four because if they hit, you win the pool. If nobody else had it, you just rack up the points. You're basically, I mean, I won a pool like that with Loyola Chicago 5 years ago, where I'm taking Loyola Chicago. Nobody's picking them, and they have to hit. So yeah, things get wild because if you're getting a ton of points and you're getting a 33, 35% win odds, that makes a lot of sense to take some wild swings because you don't have to hit nearly all of them. You just have to hit a couple.
Yeah. Okay, last region to cover here seems almost as balanced as the West, and that is the East, where Purdue is the number one seed and the favorite to make the Final Four. Marquette is also here. Tennessee is also here. I'll start with you here, Jack. What do you think about the East bracket and finding leverage there?
Yeah, I think it's another tough region. I'm curious to see where Duke ends up at ownership wise because, like we talked about earlier, the past month they've just been on an absolute tear. It's a completely different team than it was early in the season, and so while their full season numbers on some of these advanced metric sites might not jump off the page, they've been really really good over the past month. So they're one I'm interested in. I think this. I mean, you don't need to do this in again 99.9% of bracket pools, but I think Memphis is way better than an 8 seed. But they're probably losing either the first or second round, getting Florida Atlantic. That's a tough 9 seed, and then Purdue in round 2. So I think probably either Purdue or Duke is who I'm going to have in most pools, and in most pools it's going to be Purdue just as the 1 seed. Duke I think is the contrarian play, but I think the bottom half of this bracket is maybe a little weaker. Marquette is probably aptly rated, maybe slightly overrated as a 2 seed, and then Kansas State is probably not as good as your average 3 seed. So that's pretty much where I'm at. And then I do think in this region, there's something to be said for Purdue just being like such an interesting matchup because you do kind of have to think about more than maybe anyone else in the country, like how can a certain team guard 7'4" Zach Edey? And there's not many guys like Memphis might struggle with him just because they don't have as much of like a true center on their roster.
Jason, go ahead on this final region here featuring Purdue.
Yeah, I'll just make some comments on Purdue. This doesn't mean don't pick them. I think the market's assessing them, but Purdue has had issues with teams that can force turnovers. They've struggled late in games. Their guards are like freshmen and young guys. They're an extreme team. Edey's dominant inside, and their guards don't always play great against pressure. And so we saw teams like Rutgers, like Northwestern, who can extend pressure, really give them problems. Memphis and Florida Atlantic are athletic, so that concerns me. But that's probably something I'm looking at more in the betting markets than necessarily a bracket, because I don't want to guess the wrong one, even if I want to pick an upset, right? Memphis, Florida Atlantic's like closer to a toss-up. This region as a whole, Purdue has the highest advance odds because they're the 1 seed. They're a virtual lock in the first round. That said, I think Duke and Marquette probably come up on the value front and narrow the gap. And so this is another one where you could see a mix of picks. Duke's even in play, depending on your pool size here. We've got them power rated just under Purdue as the second best team in this region. And they have 2 7-footers. So if you're talking about matching up with Edey, they actually do have height. If this young team can not get knocked off right away to Oral Roberts and can get on a roll. Like if you told me Duke's in the Sweet 16, I really like them. But, they got to get there. They got the tougher draw than Purdue to get there. So I do think those things are all in play. Purdue staying safe versus value on Duke versus Marquette coming out of the other side that people aren't necessarily all over.
And now that we're talking through this, my mind is like, oh, Duke is going to be sneaky. We pick them to go to the Final Four. I feel like that's going to be what everyone thinks. And we see this in DFS. Like there's a lot of leveling that goes on where people are like, oh, this team's really sneaky, or this guy's really sneaky. And the next thing you know, you open it up and he's 30% owned, right? Is there danger of that happening with Duke here, Jason?
Right now, we're not seeing that. To get to the Final Four, they're dead on with the pick rate, which is actually decent. So basically, Purdue's picked twice as often as them, but we've got Purdue at about 1.5 times as likely to make it. So you're narrowing the gap there. Purdue's not like Duke's not like super popular.
Okay.
Purdue and Marquette are more popular relative to their win odds.
All right. We've gone long enough without making an actual pick here that people want actual picks. Jack, I'll start with you. We'll go, who do you think will win it? And then maybe a contrarian team that you would pick in a larger field pool to win it.
Yeah, I'll take Houston to win it. I think with Sasser healthy, they're the best team in the country, and I think he will be healthy. He warmed up before the AAC championship, so I think, I don't know, maybe not first round, but I expect by the weekend he should be basically good to go. And then contrarian, I'm going to stick with Creighton. I don't think you need it in the vast majority of pools, but I do think they're underseeded. I do think the bottom half of the South is a little weaker. Bama is a complete wagon, but I think maybe if they can get to the Elite Eight, who knows what could happen. So I'll take Creighton as my super contrarian play.
All right. Houston and Creighton for Jack. Jason, we'll go with your most likely win, your pick to win, and then a contrarian pick to win.
I mean, I'm with him. If I were just to pick one team to pick in a bracket of integrity, Houston would be my pick narrowly over Alabama. That actually may be a good combo. A lot of people don't like to pick 1 versus 1s in the final. So in a small pool, you may get both the favorites and have an edge if you just pick the 2 favorites to match up instead of only one of them in the final. So I'm thinking Houston there. If we're talking below the top 2 seed lines, I'm looking at Duke and Connecticut as the value plays that actually aren't that popular with the general public, but are rising in the betting market. So I think if you're in a sharp pool, it's different. But if you're with just a bunch of buddies, I don't think people are all over Duke and UConn. And so those are the ones I'm looking at. And if I'm getting really crazy, I'm looking at things like who could be this year's North Carolina, a team like Arkansas, if they were to knock off defending champion Kansas, has a talented freshman, has athletes, but man, they could also lose right away. So teams like that, like really deep sleepers.
All right. I'm going to go Kansas to win and Penn State contrarian winner. Shout out Penn State. Return to glory for the program. We've said it.
Jalen Pickett, you got to have a guy who will take over games, and he can do that.
Exactly. All right. We said it all here on March Madness. Again, one of the great weeks and few weeks of the year here, even if you don't like college basketball. It's so fun. And hopefully this gave you guys an idea of what you can do if thinking about brackets from a strategy perspective, from a more macro perspective, from a more sophisticated level than just picking some teams. If you want more help with your bracket, go to poolgenius.com/ETR. Again, that's poolgenius.com/ETR. You get all the customizable stuff that Jason was talking about. Check out all the details there. Have to give Jason and Jack a chance to be on the social media machine. Jack, tell the people where they can find you on Twitter or anywhere else you can be found.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at JackMiller02. You can find my writing on Establish the Run. So thanks for having me on and talking through all this. This was fun.
Yes, Jack is our closet college basketball freak, as I said. Jason, where can the people find you and your work?
I'm at Jason Lisk. You can also just come to Team Rankings Pool Genius. Lots of articles, strategy articles, and videos. And I'll say, even if you're not brackets, we have survivor pools, we have Calcuttas, we have tools related to that as well with under the same subscription. So if you, like myself, love some Ncaa survivor pool action where you get really crazy and can only use a team once, we also have something that'll give you some advice there.
Interesting stuff. There's a whole world of college basketball out there I'm not even aware of. It's a beautiful thing. Okay, that's going to do it for this March Madness bracket pool edition of the show. We'll be back later this week or early next week to talk through everything that happens in NFL free agency with Silva. Hot stove is starting to cook in the NFL for sure. It's a shame that it's getting overshadowed, or one is overshadowing the other. I wish they were separated a little bit, but March Madness and free agency will be going on at the exact same time. For Jack, for Jason, for producer Luke, I'm Adam. Good luck, everybody.